Boldwood presents Murder at Mill Pond's House, written by Michelle Salter and read by Polly Edsel. Chapter 1. Walden, Hampshire, 1st of May 1924. It turned out that Elijah's snail pace was the ideal speed when trailing a procession of schoolchildren dressed as spring flowers. We sauntered along the side of the road, keeping out of the way of the crowds of parents lining the high street. As the Walden Herald's only permanent reporter, I was usually assigned to cover the May Day pageant on my own. However, this year was different. Reverend Childs had decided to combine the town's annual May Day festivities with the opening of Mill Pond's Hostel for Men. Elijah Whittle, the newspaper's editor, had received a personal request from the vicar to attend the event. The hostel would provide temporary accommodation for unemployed and disabled men, many of them ex-soldiers and sailors who were suffering hardship due to the effects of war. Townsfolk were concerned at the arrival of these newcomers, and the vicar hoped an invitation to visit the newly refurbished mansion would help ease any tensions. So, along with a good proportion of the residents of the small market town of Walden, Elijah and I followed the school children down the high street to the railway station, where a footpath led to Waldenmere Lake. At this point, things got a little tricky, as the procession was to join the lake path, which would allow for just two abreast. Mrs. Siddons, our local MP, and only the third woman elected to Parliament, led the parade, holding aloft a bright yellow parasol to make sure she was seen. It was unlikely anyone could miss her, as she was wearing a startling lime green silk dress, with a yellow scarf billowing behind her on the breeze. She'd become involved in politics after the death of her husband, and at the age of 51 had achieved her ambition of taking a seat in the House of Commons by winning the Aldershot by-election in 1920. The mood of the crowd was jovial as they jostled along behind her on the narrow footpath. Once we turned onto the driveway of Mill Pond's house, people spilled out onto the freshly mown lawn, the smell of cut grass heightening the sense that summer had finally arrived. The children rushed towards a tall wooden maypole decorated with trails of ivy and colourful crepe paper flowers. To my annoyance, the sun chose that moment to break through the clouds and shine down on the red bricks of Mill Ponds. It felt like everyone was giving the project their blessing. Everyone except me. It's not that I was against the hostel, just the man the church had employed to run it. "Archibald Powell is here to stay," Elijah said as if reading my mind, "and I'm afraid there's nothing you can do about it." He removed his Homburg hat and mopped his brow with a handkerchief, grunting with relief as the May Day procession began to disperse. He was dressed far too warmly for the occasion, as, for once, the first day of May actually was proving to be the start of summer. Don't be so sure about that. I stared at the black-clad figure guiding each child to a long strand of ribbon dangling from the maypole. As usual, Archie was dressed in a dark shirt and trousers, in an attempt to look like a vicar. But he wasn't one. Not anymore. "What do you mean?" Elijah rooted around in the pocket of his jacket for his cigarettes. "Just that his stay in Walden might not be as permanent as he thinks." I didn't yet know how, but I was determined to find a way to make Archie leave my hometown. I wouldn't sanction his presence at Mill Ponds as easily as some had. As I said this, Archie's green eyes turned in my direction, and his lips widened into the malevolent wolfish grin he seemed to save just for me. It was part sneer, part threat. The attraction I'd felt when I'd first met him in the autumn of 1922 had long since vanished. At the time, his contradictory personality had intrigued me, and I'd been drawn to his embrace on one too many occasions. Fortunately, I'd had the sense to draw back before the relationship could develop into something more serious. I'd begun to suspect that all was not what it seemed, and I'd been proved right. At the time, he'd been the Reverend Archibald Powell of St. Mary's Church in Deptford. His charitable work included running Creek House, a hostel that offered temporary accommodation to unemployed and disabled ex-servicemen. It was a property owned by the wealthy Timpson family, and he'd repaid their trust by turning sniper and firing a rifle at businesswoman Constance Timpson. He'd used the same tactic on Mrs. Siddons, MP, in a bid to scare women from positions of power. As a result, he'd been detained at His Majesty's pleasure in Winchester Prison, though his sentence had been cut short due to his exemplary behaviour. Elijah waved his cigarette in my direction. "You need to accept what you can't change." This was easy for him to say. He wasn't being blackmailed. Ever since New Year's Eve, Archie had been taunting me with a secret he knew I didn't want anyone to find out. He wasn't asking me for money. It was simply a case of leave him alone, and he'd leave me alone. But if I didn't comply, he'd tell my family and friends what he knew. 4 months on, I was sick of living with this threat hanging over me. It was Archie or me. One of us had to go. Chapter 2. "Are you all right?" Millicent mouthed as she reached out to stop a little girl's spectacles falling from her nose and into the path of the maypole dancers. With the other hand, she rescued a small boy from the ribbons he'd become tangled up in. As a teacher at Walden Elementary School, Miss Millicent Nightingale was adept at doing more than 3 things at the same time. I'd been lodging with Millicent and her great-aunt Ursula since the previous summer. Millicent was the only one who knew of the close friendship I'd once had with Archie Powell, though I think both Elijah and Ursula suspected. "I'm fine," I mouthed back, feeling anything but. I wasn't the only one horrified by Archie's decision to take up residence in Walden after his release from prison. The Honourable Constance Timpson was furious that her attacker was now living in her hometown and refused to have anything to do with him or the hostel. As a wealthy businesswoman, she'd been asked to become a benefactor and patron of Mill Pond's house, an invitation she'd declined. However, Mrs. Siddons had chosen to deal with Archie in her own inimitable way, and it was a method I was still uneasy about. I said as much when she appeared by my side, peering at me through the lorgnette spectacles she'd taken to holding instead of wearing glasses. "As a patron of Mill Ponds, I can ensure Mr. Powell behaves himself." Mrs. Siddons closed her parasol and pointed it like a weapon. "If he doesn't, I'm in a position to make his life extremely uncomfortable." I didn't doubt she would do just that. But if Archie thought he was under attack, especially from a woman, he'd retaliate. And that might lead him to reveal my secret to those people he knew I cared about most. "Why do you think he came here?" I asked. "To seek redemption," she replied. "Rather than running away from his crimes, he's facing up to them." "He's not. He's pretending." But I knew it was hopeless. It was infuriating that she, along with everyone else in town, seemed to have fallen for Archie's act. Only I understood him well enough to know he felt no remorse for his actions. His intention had been clear when he'd carried a rifle up to the tower of St. Mary's Church and pointed it at Constance while she was giving a speech outside the factory opposite. He'd taken care to miss her, instead firing into a wooden display board behind her head. When he'd played the same trick on Mrs. Siddons, Ben Gilbert, our local policeman and a childhood friend of mine, had been injured trying to protect her. In court, Archie's barrister had blamed these unfortunate incidents on shell shock, citing the commendations the Reverend Powell had received after serving as an army chaplain during the war. It was true Archie had risked his life to save others. It was also true he hadn't meant to physically harm Constance Timpson or Mrs. Siddons when he'd fired those shots. However, I knew Archie hadn't been suffering from shell shock. Before his arrest, he told me he'd been trying to restore some of the natural order that was lost during the war. "I understand how you feel." Mrs. Siddons took my arm in a conciliatory gesture. We'd been friends for over 10 years, since my mother's death in 1914, and this was our first serious disagreement. I wish he hadn't chosen to come here, but he has, and we must learn to accept the situation rather than fight it. Accepting things I didn't like was not my strong point, and I looked in vain to Elijah for support. He shrugged. Mill Ponds was sitting empty. At least it's now being put to good use. Don't worry. You have Mr. Whittle and me to act as your chaperones and protect you while you're here. Mrs. Siddons must have seen the flash of annoyance on my face because she added, I'm not being flippant. I realise he makes you uncomfortable. This was an understatement. I pulled my arm away. I'm going to help Robbie, I muttered, trying not to let my temper show. Robbie Roper, the Walden Herald's photographer, stood out amongst the crowd of townsfolk gathered on the lawn. 6 foot tall, with copper hair glinting in the sunshine, he moved his camera easily amongst the children as they skipped around the maypole. He didn't need any assistance from me. Millicent was still preoccupied with her pupils, and Archie was standing close by. Infuriated by his self-satisfied smirk, I turned my back on the throngs of people and wandered around to the side of the house. The mill of the house's name was long gone, and this section of the garden had an uninterrupted view of Waldenmere. The previous owner had planted a rose garden to enhance the scene, and sweet-scented pink and lilac blooms provided bursts of colour against the silver backdrop of the lake. I breathed in their perfume, enjoying a peace I knew would be short-lived. Sure enough, Archie appeared from around the side of the house, and I studied him as he approached. He still had the physique of a soldier, and there was something animal-like about his narrow, intense eyes and sculpted jaw. He was tall, over 6 foot, though I noticed a stooping of his broad shoulders that hadn't been there before. When we'd first met, his penetrating green eyes had scrutinized me with a lazy sexuality that had been hard to resist. His demeanour had been completely at odds with the dog collar around his neck. Nowadays he looked at me with a mixture of resentment and triumph. Still dressing in black? I couldn't resist taunting his attempt to replicate his former clerical garb. Doesn't quite cut it. I knew how much it had hurt him to be stripped of his ecclesiastical office, perhaps even more than the prison sentence he'd received. He blamed me for both. I'd gone to the police when I discovered he was the mysterious sniper, and he'd never forgiven me for that. He'd accused me of betrayal and been arrogant enough to believe he could persuade me to stay silent. On his release from prison, Archie had headed straight back to the church, despite being unable to return to his former occupation. Instead, he'd become a verger at Winchester Cathedral and joined the fundraising committee of their war fund. When the church purchased Mill Pond's house to use as a hostel, he was appointed manager, due to his experience running Creek House in Deptford. "How's the charming Mr. Jansen?" Archie took a small diary from his trouser pocket and flicked through the pages. "Here it is. Mr. Mark Jansen, Tyler and Simcock, Chancery Lane." 4 months ago, on New Year's Eve, Archie had revealed he'd been spying on me. On one of my regular trips to London, he'd seen me with Mark Jansen, a man I had a complicated relationship with. After following Mark back to his office, Archie had made a few discreet inquiries. It hadn't taken much detective work to find out that Mark was a solicitor, and that he was married. Archie became convinced Mark and I were having an affair. Although this wasn't true, it was certainly a friendship I'd have trouble explaining to those closest to me. The secret nature of our meetings was enough to incriminate us in most people's eyes. At the mention of Mark's name, I began to walk away, but Archie put out a hand to stop me. "You haven't seen the rest of the garden yet. It's going to provide a form of therapy for our residents." He turned and strode towards the rear of the house. "We've acquired more land where we can grow fruit and vegetables, And we've started to dig the foundations for a greenhouse. It will be good for the men to have something to occupy them, and we can supply produce for the kitchen. Come and take a look so you can describe our plans in your article." "What article?" I followed him through the walled kitchen garden, curious to see the changes that had been made. The church had recently purchased a stretch of wasteland beside the railway line and enclosed it behind a tall wooden fence. You could now exit the extended garden of Mill Ponds via a gate that opened onto a dirt track leading up to an arched bridge over the railway line. On the other side of the track were rows of allotments owned by the railway company and rented out to their workers. "You're going to write an article explaining our concept for Mill Ponds." Archie made a show of opening the double doors to a large, newly built shed. "And I'll let you know when you can call in for a chat with our first 3 residents. It will be one morning next week." "And if I don't?" Archie turned and gave me his familiar wolfish smile. "I have nothing left to hide. Everyone knows what I did. What about you?" I shrugged. Elijah had already asked me to write a feature on Mill Ponds. It would look odd if the Walden Herald didn't cover such a newsworthy event. However, Archie couldn't control what I wrote. I was about to say as much when something caught my eye. He'd pushed open the shed's wooden doors to reveal racks of gardening tools and shelves lined with plant pots. I peered inside, my breath catching in my throat. Leaning against the wall was a Lee Enfield rifle. I knew the make from Archie's previous escapades with a gun. It was probably an old army rifle used in the war. My hands balled into fists. "What the hell are you doing with that?" I knew this was why he'd insisted on showing me the garden, just so I would see it. "I still like to go hunting now and again." He was watching me with malevolent glee, clearly enjoying my reaction. He stepped into the shed and lifted up the rifle. When he turned, he pointed it in my direction. "It's to deal with pests." His lips curled into a cruel smile. "I don't intend to let vermin ruin my hard work." I said nothing and held my ground. I doubted he'd risk firing it with so many people around. Yet, hadn't he done exactly that when he'd shot at Constance and then Mrs. Siddons? Laughing, he placed the rifle back against the wall. "Don't worry, it's only to kill rabbits and pigeons. And possibly women who need to be reminded of their place." Chapter 3. I turned away from Archie, tense with fear and anger. He was enjoying making my life a misery, and I felt powerless to stop him. As I hurried through the garden, I caught sight of a man in a khaki army jumper, standing in one of the foundation trenches dug for the new greenhouse. He leant against his spade and stared at me, making no attempt to hide his curiosity. I wondered how much of our conversation he'd overheard. Surely he couldn't have failed to notice that Archie had just pointed a rifle in my direction. "I'll tell you when you can come and interview our first residents," Archie called after me. I ignored him and kept walking, glancing towards the strange man who was still watching us. He ran a hand through his dark blonde hair as if confused. Had Archie just made his first mistake? Judging by the man's expression, he was shocked by what he'd witnessed. Once I was back on the lawn with the other guests, I let out a long breath. Mrs. Siddons shot me a concerned look, but I ignored her and went in search of Elijah. I found him standing with Robbie by the entrance to Mill Ponds. "Can we go now?" I asked. "I think I've seen enough for one day." "We haven't been in the house yet. I believe they've turned the General's old reception room into a communal lounge. I want Robbie to get a photo of it." He took a last drag on his cigarette and stubbed it out in a plant pot by the oak front door. "Let's see what they've done to the old place." My tension returned. I had no desire to go inside, and it had nothing to do with the presence of Archie Powell. It was because I had extremely unpleasant memories of the last time I'd set foot in Mill Pond's house. During the war, the mansion had been used as a training academy for cadet officers. Its owner, General Cheverton, had welcomed terrified new recruits into his home and guided them through the brutalities of 4 years of war. I supposed it was fitting that it was now opening its doors to troubled men once again. After the General's murder in 1921, Mill Pond's house had stood empty until Winchester Cathedral's Great War Fund had purchased it. They'd been able to buy it for a knockdown price thanks to the mansion's tainted history. General Cheverton's nephew had inherited the property, and his gambling debts meant he would have taken whatever was offered to be rid of it. "I haven't been back here since we broke in," Elijah whispered, holding open the door for me. I smiled for the first time that afternoon, remembering what a hopeless pair of housebreakers we'd made. Shortly after General Cheverton's death, we'd illegally obtained access to Mill Ponds to search through confidential documents kept in the General's study. On that occasion, we'd gained access via the scullery and crept through the house with a torch. Now we entered the hallway to a very different scene. "His Lord and Ladyship welcome you to their humble abode," Robbie said in an undertone. I had to stifle a laugh at the sight of Gordon and Jennifer Tolfrey standing at the foot of the staircase, welcoming guests as if this was their stately home rather than a men's hostel. Along with Mrs. Siddons, Gordon Tolfrey was a patron of Mill Pond's house, and as a committee member of Winchester Cathedral's Great War Fund, he'd influenced their decision to buy the old mansion. "You'd think they owned the place," I whispered. I suspected, like Archie, the Tolfreys saw their involvement with the hostel as a way of polishing up a tarnished reputation. "Mr. Roper," Jennifer called when she caught sight of Robbie, "I'm sure you'd like a photograph of my husband and me for the Walden Herald." Elijah grinned and nodded at Robbie, who duly obliged, positioning his camera on its tripod while Mr. and Mrs. Tolfrey adopted their most regal expressions. At one time, the name Tolfrey had been famous across the globe. Founded by Isaac Tolfrey in 1850, Tolfrey biscuits, decorative tins, were sent all over the world. Even Captain Scott had taken Tolfrey biscuits on his expedition to the South Pole, as the tins preserved the biscuits inside. After the war, Tolfrey biscuits' fortunes declined as the price of ingredients rose. The business was on the brink of collapse when Timpson Foods bailed out Gordon's father, Redvers Tolfrey, adding the Timpson name to the famous brand at the same time. A furious Redvers had sought revenge by embezzling from Tolfrey and Timpson, then died of a heart attack before the case went to trial. Gordon and Jennifer, an attractive couple in their 30s, were endeavouring to repair the damage Redvers had done to the family name. Gordon owned a successful motorcar dealership in Winchester and had made generous donations to church funds since Redvers' death. He was a well-built man of 35, who bore a strong resemblance to his late father, sporting the same neatly trimmed chestnut hair and beard in the style of King George. His wife Jennifer was a few years older, but looked younger. Whenever I saw her around town, she was always dressed in the latest fashions, and her blonde hair was generally rolled into an elaborate chignon, a style that suited her elegant neck. "Is that?" Elijah whispered, indicating with his eyes to a figure across the hall. Standing to one side of the staircase was Gordon's mother, Gertrude Tolfrey. Since her husband's death, Gertrude had become a reclusive figure. I generally only saw her on my rare visits to church on Sunday morning, where she ignored me. To be fair, she ignored most people, but in my case, she had a particular reason for avoiding me. I'd helped my friend, Constance Timpson, uncover Redvers Tolfrey's embezzlement. For a long time, Gordon had blamed me and Constance for his father's downfall. More recently, he'd come to accept Redvers' guilt, and we'd declared an uneasy truce. However, I had a feeling his mother wouldn't be so forgiving. Gertrude was a tall woman with iron grey hair and a long nose that gave the impression she was looking down on you. Her grandchildren stood next to her. I remembered Millicent telling me that Daisy was the older of the two, aged 10, and her younger brother Luke was 9. To my surprise, when Gordon took his children's hands and led them out into the garden, Gertrude came over to talk to me. I turned to Elijah for support, only to find he'd wandered off with Robbie to admire the General's old grandfather clock, still standing in the corner of the hallway. "Miss Woodmore." Gertrude's grey eyes studied my attire with disdain. This was clearly a woman who would never embrace the latest fashion for trousers. "Mrs. Tolfrey, how nice to see you." I self-consciously pulled at my pleated navy slacks, feeling out of place. Gertrude looked very much at home in Mill Ponds, her lavender scent mingling with the beeswax floor polish to create an atmosphere of fusty gentility. I wondered how the homeless and unemployed residents would feel in this refined setting. "I'm pleased you felt you could come here today." Her tone implied that she wished I hadn't. "We're glad to welcome you." I felt like pointing out that I was a guest of the vicar, not the Tolfreys, but I said nothing and smiled politely. "I'll come straight to the point. I appreciate that Mr. Powell may not be your favourite person after what he did. However, he's paid for his crimes and is trying to atone for past mistakes. He's shown what can be achieved with charity and compassion, and I think it's time to forgive and forget and let him do what he does best." I'd heard this before and wasn't about to relent. Mr. Powell may have helped many people in the past, I agreed, then added, but he's harmed plenty of others. Over her shoulder, I saw Archie come through a door at the back of the house. He caught Jennifer Tolfrey's eye, and the pair disappeared into the study together. I was tempted to point out to Gertrude that, as well as his criminal acts, Archie had a history of behaviour that, although not illegal, was certainly morally dubious. He had a predatory nature when it came to women, and I suspected Jennifer was his latest victim. "I'm sure none of us are perfect." Gertrude looked me up and down as she said this. "Perhaps in time you'll learn to be more charitable. My son and Mr. Powell have worked hard to get this place up and running, and it's destined to help many men rebuild their lives. I trust the Walden Herald will support them in their endeavours." With that, she turned and walked away. It seemed Archie wasn't the only one who saw Mill Ponds as a ticket back to respectability. I was beginning to wonder how much the hostel had been set up to help the men housed there, or simply the people running it. It was clear the Tolfreys were intent on re-establishing themselves as one of the prominent families in Walden, and I had no doubt Archie was enjoying exploiting their desperation to regain their social position. He was a master manipulator. I could picture him playing up to each member of the Tolfrey family. However, I had a feeling he may have taken things too far with Jennifer. I rejoined Elijah and Robbie, and we sauntered through the hallway, which was much as I remembered it. The walls had been freshly papered, but the old furniture was still in place. It was of good quality, although, like the mansion, it had seen better days, having taken a battering during the time Mill Ponds House was a training academy. Elijah winked at me as we passed the door to what had been General Cheverton's study. This was the room we'd searched 3 years earlier, falling over in our attempts to light the gas lamp to see what we were doing. It was lucky we hadn't set fire to the carpet. I wondered if Archie was still in there with Jennifer Tolfrey, or if they'd left by the French doors and gone out into the garden. If there hadn't been anyone around, I'd have pressed my ear to the study door to listen. Instead, I followed Elijah into the large reception room, which the General had used to welcome military dignitaries during the war. It was now a communal lounge, fitted out to be more functional than stylish, with plain, comfortable sofas and lots of small tables. The most eye-catching features were the beautiful paintings on the walls, I recognised them immediately. Robbie began taking photographs, while Elijah examined them with interest, his eyes widening with astonishment when I told him Archie had painted them. He pointed to a particularly bucolic scene. "They seem completely at odds with the man." I nodded, remembering the first time I'd seen Archie's paintings. He'd been staying in a cottage near Crookham Hall, working on a landscape of the surrounding countryside. Like Elijah, I'd been surprised by their serenity. There was a spiritual quality to how Archie depicted nature, with vast open spaces and lots of natural light. I'd told Archie about the pictures I'd seen by soldiers who'd taken up painting as a way of coming to terms with the horrors they'd endured in the trenches. Some had painted desolate landscapes, while others depicted gruesome scenes of mud, blood, and barbed wire in harsh blocks of colour. Archie had said that, through his faith, he'd made peace with his time on the battlefields, and his art celebrated the healing powers of nature. I showed Elijah some of the landscapes painted on the Crookham estate. These aren't the work of a disturbed mind. When Archie claimed to be suffering from shell shock, I knew it wasn't true because of what he'd told me about his paintings. They represent how Archie thinks the world should be, and if something doesn't conform to that, he tries to change it. "Using brute force, if necessary," Elijah remarked. I shuddered, thinking of the rifle propped up against the wall of the shed. Chapter 4. After work the following day, I headed to the Tolfrey and Timpson biscuit factory. I'd promised to call on Constance Timpson and tell her about the Mill Ponds Open Day. Unlike Mrs. Siddons, she had no intention of forgiving Archie Powell for the shot he'd fired at her, and I considered her one of my few allies. The sprawling biscuit factory had been built by Gordon's grandfather Isaac Tolfrey in 1850, and was situated on the outskirts of Walden on the banks of the Basingstoke Canal. At one time, its produce had been transported along the waterway, but Constance now used the services of a road haulage company. Like canals across the country, commercial traffic was in decline, and pleasure boating had taken its place. When I entered the factory, I sensed immediately something was wrong. It took me a moment to realise what it was. The workers were all still and unnaturally silent. A second later, I realised why. Shouts were coming from the offices above, and they were trying to hear what was being said above the noise of the conveyor belts. I hurried over to Nora Fox, who I'd become friends with 2 years earlier, when I'd helped Constance investigate Redvers Tolfrey's double-dealing. "What's going on?" "Archie Powell walked in bold as brass with another bloke, and they went upstairs to Miss Timpson's office." Nora's face was flushed from the heat of the machines, and her white muslin cap stuck damply to her crimped hair. The air around us was clammy, as clouds of steam spread the sickly sweet smell of baking biscuits. "Is she on her own?" Nora shook her head. "Lord Timpson is with her. He's been doing most of the shouting." I bounded up the stairs 2 at a time. Daniel Timpson was the most placid of creatures. I'd never heard him so much as raise his voice. Shouting didn't bode well. "How dare you come here?" he was yelling when I entered the office. Daniel was slim and of medium height, while Archie was around 6 feet tall and muscular in build. This didn't deter Daniel from squaring up to him, his face red with anger. Constance stood behind her brother, reaching out to restrain him. The other person in the room was holding on to Archie, trying to pull him away. I realised it was the chap I'd seen in the garden the previous day. He was dressed in the same working clothes of dark corduroy trousers and an old army jumper. "Isn't it about time we put our grievances behind us?" Archie was saying. I walked past him and picked up the telephone on Constance's desk. "Could you put me through to the station house, please?" I said to the operator. Archie turned on me. "You're calling the police?" "That's right. Sergeant Gilbert made it clear he would arrest you if you harassed your former victims. I'm not harassing anyone. I'm merely inquiring about the possibility of employment for one of my men. I noticed the proprietary way he said, my men. His companion noticed it too, and raised his eyebrows. I think we should leave, he said, pulling Archie by the arm. I'm sorry to have upset you, miss. I'm not going anywhere. Archie tried to shrug him off. I haven't done anything wrong. You shot at my sister and nearly killed Ben. Daniel yelled. Why don't you get the hell out of Walden? Walden is my home. I'm sorry if... Ben, it's Iris, I said, even though the operator hadn't yet put me through. I'm at the Tollfree and Timpson factory. Archie Powell is threatening Miss Timpson. He doesn't appear to be armed, although I know he keeps a rifle at Mill Pond's house. Can you come immediately? This is ridiculous. I'm not threatening anyone. Archie snarled, but this time he allowed his companion to drag him away. Daniel made to follow, and I quickly replaced the mouthpiece in its cradle and made a grab for him, slamming the door closed as I did. Is Ben coming? Constance flicked a stray lock of glossy dark hair over her shoulder. I hadn't actually been put through. She smiled and slumped into the chair behind her rosewood desk. The sheer bloody arrogance of the man, Daniel muttered, pacing the room. What the hell are we going to do about him? I let go of his arm, wishing I had an answer to that. Constance looked up. You said Archie had a rifle. I nodded, wishing I hadn't thrown that into my imaginary conversation with Ben. Constance had every reason to be afraid of Archie, even though I didn't think he'd risk targeting her again. I saw it yesterday, in a shed at Mill Ponds. On my way home, I stopped at the station house to tell Ben. He said he'd talk to Archie about it. He's probably taken it away by now. What Ben had actually said was that he'd check the rifle's ownership, and if it had a certificate, there wasn't much he could do about it. Constance raised her hands to her temples. Who was that man with Archie? I hoped you might be able to tell me that, I replied. I saw him yesterday in the garden at Mill Ponds. I suppose he must be one of their first residents. Archie tried to introduce him, but I didn't catch his name. Constance glanced at Daniel as she said this. I told them to get out as soon as they walked in. Daniel was still pacing the room. I'd only popped in to pick up Constance. Good job too, otherwise she would have had to face them alone. I saw by Constance's face that, had she been on her own, she would have handled things differently. For a start, she wouldn't have caused a row that her whole factory could hear. She stood up. I've had enough for one day. Come on. She took Daniel's arm. Let's go home. Home for the Timpsons was Crookham Hall, the ancestral estate Daniel had inherited, along with the title of Lord Timpson, on his father's death. The Honourable Constance Timpson had inherited the family business from her mother, Lady Timpson, 2 years earlier. Despite the prejudices she faced as a woman in her mid-20s running a large empire, she'd succeeded in making Timpson Foods even more profitable than it had been in her mother and grandfather's day. I was the same age as Constance and was in awe of her ability to stand up to her mostly older and male business rivals. Pulling on an elegant navy cape that covered her formal work suit, Constance led the way downstairs, where her workers were preparing to go home. They had the sense not to mention the row they'd just overheard. She wished them a good evening and walked through the conveyor belts and out into the yard. Would you like me to drive you home, Iris? Daniel asked as he opened the door of the Daimler that had once belonged to his mother. Yes, please. Millicent should be back from school by now. Why don't you pop in to see her? I don't want to intrude. I'd like to see Ursula, Constance said, in a tone that settled the matter. She knew Millicent was far better at calming Daniel than she was. One of the many things I liked about Daniel was that he'd fallen in love with my good friend Millicent, despite the disparity in their social positions. Although Millicent reciprocated his feelings, if she were to marry, she'd have to give up her job as a schoolteacher. So far, they'd yet to reach a solution to this impediment to their relationship. When we reached 13 Victoria Lane, I showed Daniel and Constance into the parlour and went in search of Millicent and Ursula. I found them in the kitchen and told them briefly what had happened. Millicent dashed from the room to go to Daniel, and a few moments later, Constance joined Ursula and me in the kitchen. Ursula turned off the stove and started to hunt around for the sherry. I pointed to the lowest shelf. She was a diminutive woman and would take us to task if we placed any vital supplies, such as sherry bottles, out of her reach. Ursula poured us each a glass, and we sat around the kitchen table, Constance describing what had happened before I arrived at the factory. It was the way he walked in, without even knocking, as though he had every right to be there. No acknowledgement, let alone an apology for what he did, she told Ursula. I noticed how she often looked to the older woman for guidance. She had no parents to turn to, and running Timpson Foods on her own was a lonely business. Although Constance possessed a classically beautiful face and razor-sharp mind, this combination tended to intimidate men rather than attract them. In a male-dominated world, Mrs. Siddons was her only ally in business matters, but, like me, she'd fallen out with her over Archie. Ursula, who'd led an adventurous life that included many lovers and no husbands, was a trusted advisor when it came to personal matters. Archie's arrogant. Ursula propped her glasses on her head, causing her mane of grey hair to spring up even further. He thinks he can force people into accepting the situation, and that will be his downfall. He's being too brash, too forceful. If he went quietly about his business and made a success of this hostel, people would, in time, come to forgive and forget. I suspect that's what the Tolfreys are hoping for. I nodded. Even Gertrude was there yesterday. I get the impression she thinks Mill Ponds will redeem the family name. At least they're civil to me nowadays, Constance said. She'd become the sole owner of Tolfrey and Timpson Biscuits when Redvers Tolfrey was forced to sell his remaining shares to her. At the time, there had been some resentment on the part of the Tolfrey family. However, they now recognised Redvers' financial situation would have been far worse if Constance hadn't bailed him out. Gordon Tolfrey has indicated he'd welcome me as a patron of the hostel, Constance continued, and I'd happily offer my support if it wasn't for Archie Powell. We've got to get rid of him. How? I asked. Mickey Swan's helping out at Mill Ponds, and his wife, Polly, has taken a job as housekeeper there. Constance replied, Mickey's going to keep an eye on things for me. If we can get anything incriminating on Archie, even something slightly unsavoury, the church will have to kick him out. Mickey Swan was once a resident of Creek House in Deptford, the home Archie had run for unemployed and disabled ex-servicemen. Thanks to Constance, Mickey now had a job at the Tolfrey and Timpson factory, and thanks to Mrs. Siddons, his family had a home in Walden. However, Archie had also helped the Swans, and I wasn't sure how willing they'd be to cause trouble for him. But Ursula thought it was a good plan. Archie's too conceited not to trip himself up at some stage. In the meantime, don't show any hostility to him. Avoid him by all means, though treat him civilly if you run into him in town. The more you rail against him, the more he'll portray himself as the injured party, especially to the women of the parish. I knew what she was talking about. I'd seen how enamoured the Walden women's group were of the handsome former vicar. Jennifer Tolfrey was a prominent member of the group and had been singing his praises to her cohorts. Ursula was right when she said the more we crossed him, the more sympathy he'd gain. But it was easier said than done. When I was with Archie, it took every ounce of my self-possession not to slap his arrogant face, let alone be polite to him. And today, I'd infuriated him by my telephone call to the police. He wouldn't have liked being humiliated in front of one of his men. I took a swig of sherry, not daring to think how he might retaliate. Chapter 5. I waited for Archie to summon me to Mill Ponds to interview the first residents, but, in the end, it was Mickey Swan who persuaded me to talk to them. I was strolling along the high street on my way home from work when I heard someone calling my name. I looked back to see Mickey hurrying after me. It reminded me of how he'd once frightened me by following me along a dimly lit street in Deptford. He was a stocky man with sandy brown hair and strange amber eyes that had unnerved me when I'd swung around to find them staring at me in the dark. At the time, I'd believed he was attempting to scare me into staying away from Deptford. As it turned out, he'd been trying to warn me to keep away from Archie. How right he'd been. I strolled towards him. "How's it going?"
"Never been better. Polly and the children love it here. The children even like going to school. Never thought I'd say that. You can tell your friend, Miss Nightingale, they think she's the cleverest person in the world."
I smiled. "I hear you and Polly are helping out at Mill Ponds." He nodded.
"Polly's working there as housekeeper, and I've gone over a few times to help settle the new residents in. There are 3 now. Will you come and talk to them like you did to us at Creek House?"
"Do they want to be interviewed?" I asked.
"You know what it's like. They might need a bit of encouragement."
He grinned.
"You won us over in the end."
Not before the men had ridiculed the trousers I'd been wearing and intimidated me with a revolver. I hoped the newcomers to Mill Ponds wouldn't be so suspicious.
"Frank got his old job back thanks to your article,"
Mickey wheedled. This persuaded me. I'd been proud of the pieces I'd written on Creek House and what they'd achieved. Even Elijah had praised them. Okay.